Dan Abramov wrote an article about building RSCs from scratch. In that article, he attempts to explain the React server components by building an SSR from scratch using React and Node.js. Server-side rendering and the React server components are not the same concepts, rather they are complementary concepts. The server-side rendering deals with building your initial HTML on the server side. The React server components deal with sending parts of your React tree to the client side in a form of JSX. He also tweeted how the article reads like a script and someone should try and make a YouTube video out of it. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to try and make a YouTube video out of his article. So we will take inspiration from his article and go through his article from start to finish and use some of the code base that he has used, but then add our own personal touch to the app and build a server-side rendered application along with the RSCs. By the end of this video, I am confident that you will have a better understanding of the server-side rendering along with the React server components. If you're not able to follow the code, don't worry, I will add links to the GitHub repo in the description along with the link to the article. If you have any doubts to ask me, please talk to me on my Discord channel. I'll also add the links to my Discord channel in the description. That being said, grab a drink of your choice and let's start coding. Dan's article reads like a script. There are 6 steps and he goes through one by one in order to make us understand how he implements the React server components and also server-side rendering at the same time. The step 1 starts with implementing a simple HTML that's rendered on the server. Let's go ahead and start our NPM project. Once our NPM project is ready, let's go ahead and install our dev dependencies and dependencies. The dev dependencies are going to be fairly simple. We are going to install types for Node and also we're going to install TSX. And for dependencies, I'm going to install some of the tools that Dan has used in the code base. And I'm going to go ahead and install at the start of the app so that I don't really have to install them later. Once they're done, I'm going to create my index.ts file and create a simple Express server. I'm going to add a route so that I can listen to all the incoming requests. So now I'm going to copy the HTML string that Dan has used and paste it into my code base. I'm going to use a file called generator.ts and make a method called HTML generator and put all the information inside the HTML generator method. If you take a look at this method, it's actually calling the read file method to read posts from my post folder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a post folder and add 2 sample posts in it. Now that my posts are ready, it's time to call this method inside my Express route. I'm going to add the headers and see if this works. All right, so this works as expected. We are able to get the HTML from the server side. Let's do the step number 1 right now. The step number 1 deals with introducing JSX into our code base. That would mean that we would have to generate our HTML from the JSX that we pass. So in order to do that, there is a simple method that he's made. He's made a function called render JSX to HTML method. We're going to use that in our code base. So I'm going to make a new file called utils.ts and paste the render JSX to HTML method inside utils.ts. And then I'm going to copy the JSX into my code base. You can see that it's complaining a lot. So that means that I would have to change the extension of my file from TS to TSX. It's still complaining because we have to import React. So I'm going to go ahead and import React. So now everything seems to be working, and our JSX is converted to HTML, and our app is working as expected. So now let's go to step number 2. Let's invent components. He's got 2 components. One is blog post page and the other one is footer. So we're going to make a new file called components.tsx and paste all of the information there and import React so that the TypeScript doesn't really complain. And we're going to import blog post page in place of our JSX. Now we have one problem. The render method that's inside our utils.ts doesn't really know the functional components that we have. In order to support that, we have to update the method with the following code base. Let's copy the code base and update our render method. All right, now that we have updated our render method, we are ready to use our component. Cool, our component is working as expected. Now we have to introduce something called as routing for our components. Why do we need routes? Let's go back to what we have right now. So this is the blog post page, and it's got a nav bar, and it's got a content, and it's got a footer in it. If we wanted to support routing, then we should probably use the same nav bar and the same footer, but the content that's in the middle should change from one page to the other. So on the root route, we want to show a list of all the blog posts. On a sub route, we want to show that specific article. So that's what we're going to implement right now through this route method. I'm going to make 2 more components, the blog index page, and I'm going to have my blog post page. And I'm going to come back to the article and copy the match route method and paste it inside my generator.tsx. What this match route method does is it takes the URL and loads appropriate components based on the path name of the URL. And we add the JSX content that we get from the match route method inside the blog layout and generate HTML from that blog layout. And we pass the URL inside the HTML generator method. Let's see if this works as expected. This is working as expected for us. So we are able to see blog index page and we are able to see blog post page. Let's go to step number 4. We have to invent async components. The async components enable us to do the data loading inside the component itself. Let's copy the async components from here and paste it in our components file. And we're going to update our match route and replace it with a router JSX method. So now our component looks super small because we are using the post component inside our blog index page, and also we're using the post component for the specific blog post page as well. Now we will use the router component and generate HTML for that router component. But the problem is we also have to update our render JSX to HTML to support async components. And as a consequence of that, we would also have to await this whole render JSX to HTML method. Now let's go and check it out if this works. Yes, this works as expected. Let's try to do one interesting thing. Let's add an input element inside our blog layout under navbar. You can see that every time I switch from one page to another page, the state of the input gets blown away completely. This is not what we want. So we want to retain the state of the input every time we switch from one navigation to the next navigation. So in order to do that, we have to understand an important concept in the React documentation. A state is tied to location of a component in a tree. Once we have understood that, let's go to hydrate roots documentation. Let's take a look at what's happening here. So we have an input field inside the app component. And as you can see at the line number 12, we are trying to re-render the app, but the input state is not getting blown away because of the fact that the input's location is not changing on the re-renders. As long as the location of your component doesn't really change on the re-renders, the state of the component will be preserved. So this is exactly what we would want to implement. First thing we have to do is we would have to intercept the navigation. So instead of trying to let the server decide the navigation, we would have to intercept the navigation on the client side. So this is how the React router navigation works. So if you've used the React router library, so that's exactly what it does. So it intercepts the navigation and calls its own method. We would add a client.js file and we would attach this client.js methods inside. When the client requests the client.js file, we send the client.js file. And also you can see that at the line number 17, I've updated our HTML to also include the script for client.js. Now let's go ahead and check it out if this works. This is working as expected. So on switch from one route to the next route, we are sending our HTML for that route and we are attaching that HTML to the inner HTML of the body. The client.js is running, but this is not exactly what we want. We want to further improve this implementation. Instead of sending the HTML, let's send JSX. This is the basis for the implementation of the React server component. We would send the JSX instead of HTML and attach it to the existing React tree on the client side. Let's go ahead and add the implementation for the JSX. We would have to introduce a new method called JSX generator. And let's add it to our generator.tsx file. When we try to navigate from one route to the next route, it should print the JSX in an alert for us. Let me reload the app and check. And yes, that's working as expected. So if I try to navigate, you can see that I'm printing the JSX that I'm sending from my server side. This is just a JSX for the router component that we have. In order to make this into a completely usable JSX tree, we would have to render the entire JSX tree, not just the top level. Let's copy this utility method and update our utils.ts and end up with a final semantically valid JSX tree. I'm going to adjust some of the methods here in order to support the new API. Now I'm going to build it and see if I'm getting the properly rendered client-side JSX. Now if I navigate, you can see that I'm getting a semantically valid JSX tree. So this JSX tree is fully rendered, starting from HTML all the way to head and all the way to the footer. And that's the same case for both the routes. So this is a React server component. A React server component is a part of a React tree, and when attached with the client tree, it can be interleaved with the client tree and all the updates can be applied accordingly. So in order to attach this server component to our client tree, we would need to have a hydrated root. So how do we do that? By importing a hydrate root method into our client.js script. And there is another function called getInitialClientJSX. So if you have seen the hydrate root method before, you would pass the element that you use to render the initial HTML on the server side. So that's what we're going to pass here. And we will come back to this later and update it. Let's go ahead and update our navigate method. Just like you saw in the hydrate root example, we're going to update our navigate method in order to attach the client-side JSX that we get from the server to the existing React root. Now let's go ahead and update our fetch client JSX method in order to fetch the JSX from the server side. So there is one thing that we have to keep in mind is that when you try to stringify the JSX, some of the information are lost on the server side. So what we have to do is that when we stringify it, we would have to strip out those information and we try to put it back on the client side. So we would have two methods, one to stringify and the other to parse the object once it reaches the client side. Now the last part for us is to get the initial client JSX. So the initial JSX that we use to render our initial HTML has to be somehow passed on to the client side in order to hydrate the root for us. We're going to make some update to our HTML string. So this is the update to our HTML string that we have made. Let me go clean this up and explain it to you one by one. Right before I go and explain to you what's happening inside the HTML generator, I'm going to move the client JSX stringify process into a separate method that's going to be used in two places. It's going to be used in the HTML generator, and also it's going to be used in the JSX generator. Let's go ahead and see what's happening here. We pass the router and then get the JSX for the entire router tree, and we pass that to line number 21 to get the HTML for that JSX tree. And on top of that, we stringify the JSX tree and attach it to the window initial client JSX string field and send it to the client side in order that we can hydrate the root. And from line number 26 to 33, we do an import on the client side so that we can have React and React DOM downloaded as we run the script. Let me do some small updates to the code and clean it up a bit. So we have cleaned up the code and let's see if everything is working as expected. My route switch is happening and the input information is being persisted. This is exactly what we wanted. The JSX are the React server components for us. We simply attach it to our client side tree and everything is working as expected. The initial HTML is also passing the router component in order to recursively render the whole JSX tree. Once it gets the JSX tree, it converts the JSX tree into an HTML. So imagine if you move out render JSX to client JSX into a separate file, RSC.js, or maybe a separate server for that matter. You can have two servers. That is, the server-side rendering server will talk to the RSC server to get the rendered JSX tree, which will be converted back to the HTML if required. And on the same lines, the subsequent navigations will also work the same way. That's it for our implementation. Of course, there are some challenges with this implementation. You can go take a look at the article, read the challenges, and try to come up with your own solution for it. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked the video, please leave a like and subscribe for more, and I will talk to you soon.